I'm Malcolm Chalmers, and I'm going to be chairing this session today, as well as making a few introductory remarks about the MDP. This session is going to be on RUSI rules, which means all the remarks from the three of us are going to be on the record, but then the Q&A are going to be off the record. So if you do want to tweet, you can tweet what my colleagues say, but not what happens in the Q&A thereafter. In addition, can I ask you to put your mobile phones on silent? I won't ask you to switch them off, because the way things have been going today, another cabinet minister could resign. Indeed, I would urge you to let me and my fellow panelists know if a further cabinet minister has resigned, particularly if it affects departments close to defence, because that would be of great interest to our discussion. We're nothing if not agile and adaptive in RUSI. And finally, just to say, I'm delighted we have an all-RUSI panel tonight. That's a quite unusual phenomenon at RUSI, because we like to have a wide range of experts on our panel, but I think it reflects the fact that we at RUSI, my colleagues in particular, have been doing a lot of work on various different aspects of MDP as it's progressed, and this is an opportunity to bring some of those aspects together tonight. As you all know, the MDP was announced by Gavin Williamson on the 25th of January, so it's been going for just less than 6 months, but as we all know, it's the successor to the failed effort to reach conclusions on defence in the National Security Capability Review. So in effect, the Ministry of Defence has been in review mode for more than a year, exceeding in length any defence review that I can remember, but perhaps others can remember others. And if reports are right, and who knows in this week of all weeks, but if reports are right, there aren't any signs of the MDP being brought to a definitive conclusion anytime soon. And if indeed that is the case, then perhaps one of the lessons to be learnt from this review must surely be that you should not start a defence review without a viable exit strategy. A credible means of bringing it to an end. I may yet be surprised that the MDP could emerge fully formed and concluded from the Ministry of Defence tomorrow before the NATO summit. I don't think that looks likely, but I've been proven wrong in the past. Certainly, as it drags on, it does beg the question why it was started in the first place, why it was decided to announce a new review less than 2 years after the conclusion of the SDSR 2015, and without any parallel process for determining the budget level for the MOD or indeed other security departments which were part of the NSCR. And it does make me wonder whether, after 12 long years from 1998 to 2010, when I argued at the time we didn't have enough defence reviews, we may now be in danger of having far too many. And I wonder in particular whether, even if the MDP is brought to a clear conclusion sometime this year, whether we may not find the MOD pitched into a new review as part of a wider review of national security capabilities to parallel the spending review which the Chancellor has announced is going to take place and be concluded in 2019. Now, there is a credible narrative that this was never really meant to be a full-blown defence review. It was more like the 3-month exercise which aficionados of defence reviews may recall took place in 2011 to tidy up the loose ends and the lack of balancing the books of the 2010 SDSR. But the clue is in the name. It was a 3-month exercise, quick and dirty, get the books balanced, moved on. And if that had been the objective of the NSCR in relation to defence, it certainly hasn't been fulfilled this time. But clearly, as we all know, and as ministers have made clear, the SDSR 2015 did leave some very significant budgetary imbalances. Compared with the gap faced in 2010, the capability resource gap is relatively small, but it is significant. Estimates of 20 billion over 10 years without efficiency savings, probably still equivalent of 1.5 billion on the annual budget to be resolved one way or another in terms of gap, out of a total annual budget of around 40 billion. And closing that gap would have and will require some difficult decisions. Maybe some more money, maybe some capability reductions, maybe more capability reductions, the more in which new capabilities are required. But certainly so far, that was not to be. And instead, we've had to endure almost a year of constant reporting of possible cuts in MOD capabilities. And I would argue that the reputational costs of this uncertainty for British defence, both domestically and internationally, although hard to measure, have been considerable. The large investments in new capabilities that are being made are underreported, and the impression is given that our nation's defences are in deep crisis. And you only have to look at Jim Mattis's letter to our Defence Secretary in the immediate run-up to the NATO summit to show the way to demonstrate the way in which it's affecting American views of our defence capabilities. Although France, with whom the UK is compared, is aiming to meet the 2% target only in 2024, spends significantly less than the UK on defence, and over the next couple of years is not increasing its defence budget by any more than the UK. And maybe a year's reputational damage might have been worthwhile if the MOD got a massive extra funding increment as a result. But we shall see, and like most things in British politics, these things are not going to be resolved easily. We're not going to resolve those budgetary issues which overhang the whole MDP debate tonight. Rather, we are going to focus on some of the really substantial issues which the MDP has been working on over the last 6 months, and indeed the other review before that. And my two colleagues are going to in turn discuss different aspects of the substance review. First, I'm going to ask Peter to discuss single service perspectives on capability priorities, including joint force priorities. And secondly, John is going to widen the canvas further, reminding us that the MDP is not only about capabilities. It's got 4 strands of really important work, each of which is an important review of its own right. So it promises to be a packed agenda, and I look forward to the discussion that follows. Peter, would you like to get us started?
Thanks very much, Malcolm. Can if you want me to. Thanks, Malcolm. Huge honour to be here, particularly with these two. We sat down in Military Sciences, and as part of our World War I commemoration remembrance programme this year, we sat down with 12 young researchers from across the UK who've been looking at World War I throughout their sort of postgraduate studies, through their doctoral studies, and they came back with 3 significant lessons, which I'd just like to run past you. The first one was the imbalance between strategy, ambition, and capability, which was due to a lack of intellectual honesty from both the War Office and from the Admiralty into their political masters. The second one was, throughout the First World War, the lack of a kingfisher leader. There's someone who really understood and could grasp with what was happening, the threat that was changing, and how to galvanise the British military establishment, indeed the British security apparatus, to respond to it, relying instead on institutions and structures needed to overcome the lack of that kingfisher leader. The third lesson they brought out was the chronic lack of efficiency and the fact that any drive for efficiency was disastrous in war. And these were their reflections not on the British performance, but instead on the German one, which had taken a very hard-nosed approach to efficiency right from the start. It was interesting when one of the researchers came back and said, with a quote from General Henry Wilson, who is Director of Military Ops, and in 1920 he was reflecting on the war and said, there was no single campaign that the wit of man could imagine where the right answer was 6 regular divisions and 14 territorial divisions. And yet that was the force structure planning for 1913. It resonates today. An unaffordable military for the threats that are being faced. But this is not unusual. It's not simply a UK problem. If you look at the US figures, spending in excess of 3.48% of GDP, their plan to recapitalise their Navy, their Air Force, and their strategic bomber fleet is unaffordable. It cannot be done inside a 30-year timescale. So we shouldn't be shocked that asking some of these questions is really difficult and really challenging. The problem really comes, best articulated by Mike Clark, former Director General at RUSI, who was writing in the Times last week when he said, we have 3 single services who are preparing and equipping to fight 3 different wars they would prefer to have. There is an incoherence in the single service propositions for MDP. And based on this is the preconceived idea of what war will look like. And that's become deeply ingrained in the MOD through a series of doctrinal publications which sees war as a linear extension, as sterile, as clean. And yet this is unthinkable now when you look at contemporary conflict as it was back in 1913 when they looked at force structure reviews. So what does this look like for MDP? Well, I guess the first thing we should say about the capability and strategy strand of MDP, the fourth, not the first, which might appear unusual to some of you, but this was the conclusion that Joint Force 2025, that force structure that was laid out in the 2015 review, was broadly right, and that probably just needed some tinkering around the edges. And yet, it was implicit, therefore, that the security situation hadn't changed as much. But this runs contrary to everything we heard from the Prime Minister, Secretary of State, Foreign Secretary, Single Service Chiefs, Chief of Defence Staff, and the National Security Advisor. There are contradictions there that are absolutely clear. The security environment had markedly changed, and yet the proposition, the starting position for MDP, was that actually the force structure didn't need to change either. Each single service chief has made speeches over the past 6 months about these changing threats, but none of them have been able to answer a question of what they want to do differently or how they want to structure their force differently. Indeed, when pressed, most of them will publicly say they're absolutely happy with what they've got. And it's against that kind of competing narrative, that contradiction, that's a real problem. Because behind the scenes, those in the MOD understand the need for a clear, transformative change between this Joint Force 2025 force and a future force, sometime in the future. Let's call it Horizon 1. This force that actually needs to do something different, because the challenge is different. The challenge was outlined by the chairman of Joint Chiefs, Joe Dunford, in 2016 when he was talking about Russia, China, and Iran. He said they seek status as peers through economic coercion, political influence, unconventional warfare, cyber operations, information operations in order to advance their interests. They seem to be able to integrate the full range of capabilities within the national orbit. It's an adversarial competition with a military dimension short of war. And General Nick Carter said it here in January. He identified energy, cash for bribes, business practices, cyber, assassination, fake news, propaganda, and military intimidation to gain advantage as those key things that should be tackled. And yet, there was also a clarity that said that the language of deterrence in the UK didn't match that. The language, the political language, the public understanding of deterrence was based around those 4 big submarines. It hadn't extended any wider. And whilst we had the National Security Capability Review talking about modern deterrence, there was very little that sat behind it. Against that, We must look at the Joint Force 2025 or the force that follows it. And the answer to that is not what we have now. It isn't helped by the addition of strike groups, F-35, better accommodation, a V-22, CB-90, infantry fighting vehicles, or the concept of information advantage. We need to go back and have some intellectual honesty. We need to properly discuss whether a four-square division is the right answer, whether a carrier strike group is the right answer, whether literal strike groups are a good buzzword or something else, whether an 8+2 squadron mix for the RAF is anything close to reality, or does it look increasingly Napoleonic? Others around the world are looking at different things in different ways. People are looking in other defence reviews at CBRN, military resilience, war stocks, ghost fleets, reserve and mobilisation plans, integrated air and missile defence, space. President Macron last week or the week before re-announced national service, compulsory national service. The UK, therefore, feels like it's somewhat behind, both intellectually and conceptually. It's seeking prosperity through things like the Type 31E Corvette. The orders and success, the orders that are getting success are not at that level. They're at the high end. They're the Type 26, which has had that great success down in Australia. The UK seems to be misjudging the commercial opportunities as well as it is the global trends. So it seems that neither doctrine, from the UK's perspective, nor defence policy, none of these reflect the changes in the security environment that are happening at the moment, and nor does the concept of operation. The idea that an expeditionary armed force suitable for short campaigns which can deploy, arrive, have H-hour, fight, stabilise, handover, leave, go home for tea and medals just doesn't fit with how combat is being fought today. Tactics haven't evolved at all, and those that are being used are available widely on the internet. The UK has also created in Joint Force 2025 an information-dependent force, the singular belief that information will be decisive. Whether it's people or vehicles or platforms, there is a huge demand on data exchange, which at the moment is unfunded to meet those demands. It's also counter to everything we know about what the future operating environment, the future fighting environment will look like, as David Kilcullen has called it, a denied environment. These issues all appear really military. But the key is the political understanding of these. And here I think we've slightly shifted in the past few months. What we see now is a political military debate, whether it's questions from the Secretary of State on taking office or from the Prime Minister more recently, where you start to see this misunderstanding between what the offerings have been in MDP and what the politicians wish as a full spectrum or modern deterrence tool. If they say, you're telling me the security environment has changed so much since 2015, but your offerings are exactly the same as 2015, how do I stack that up? And let's face it, it's a good point. So what do we think the offerings in MDP have been and have been offered? Well, we expect they've been in ballistic missile defence, or integrated air and missile defence, another language, in cyber, in space, in efficiency, putting the EP back on track, and probably around 2025 as a new force with a new title. Whether it's Horizon 1, Conceptual Force 2028, we shall see. But we will also see a reorganisation of the force structure, perhaps the reappearance of some formations, something like Joint Force Harrier for the 2 squadrons of F-35. There's also discussions questioning how much JFC should be doing. Should it be doing more? Should it be doing less? And how is it going to be resourced? But in the absence of any agreement on money, decisions on cuts to fund some of these capabilities will have to be deferred until much later. The challenge, though, is beyond that. It is the conceptual side of developing what this new force, Horizon 1, looks like and how to get there, which is the critical point. Because at some stage, the Ministry of Defence and Single Services will have to stop buying what they're currently buying and buy something that has greater risks that might buy you an advantage in the future. Those capabilities that they'll be after don't just, or won't just, isolate, dislocate, degrade and destroy, but they're also those capabilities that will need to strengthen, preserve, weaken, position, inform, misinform, persuade and destabilise. What's interesting is the British Army's Conceptual Force Land 35 articulates some of this force design really well. It absolutely captures the essence of the future combat environment and the offering to which it can bring forward, reliant on some of those future big bets that we've heard the Chief Scientific Advisor talk about. The latest Agile Warrior paper on the Mosaic Force concept of design is a deliberate attempt to design concepts and capabilities for contingencies below the threshold of war, but with huge utility above it. The British Army is really ahead here. And the new CGS talked at RUSI Land Warfare Conference last month about the mist and disinformation age, wondering himself whether technology might trump terrain. But he also grounded warfare as a human endeavour. It was a very coherent, joined-up understanding of what the land force offering should be. But issues in the Army remain, whether it's SF, SRR, armour, long-range fires, ISR, air defence, CBRN, homeland protection. There are a myriad, none less than Army numbers. But they're in a good place. And it's also noteworthy that the Royal Marine offering for MDP, turning 3 Commando Brigade into a force that becomes experimentation-centric, a role to which the Royal Marines are almost uniquely suited, is married alongside a Marine battle group of around 1,800 Marines that are capable of operations from the sea. But talking about the Marines, I've avoided any discussion of amphibiosity, because the likelihood is that becomes unaffordable within the rest of the RN. The RN's committed a programme for a smaller fleet than is necessary or desirable. It's almost hemmed in by one. It's unable to man and protect 2 carrier strike groups, let alone potentially littoral strike groups, and with far fewer F-35s on the horizon. The future generations might look at the carrier decisions which have become a burden rather than a force multiplier. But the critical issue for them is manning. The less clear are the offerings for JFC and the Royal Air Force with their new critical areas of responsibility of cyber and space respectively. With respect to cyber and also electronic warfare, Joint Forces Command are stymied in its development by a lack of military ambition and direction and too much control being pushed over them from the West Country. Growing a military cyber capability for military use is absolutely critical. For the RAF in space, the balance that they will need to achieve between small satellites and a large program is going to be absolutely key. But the demands that there are and balancing the ambition here is not just complex, it's almost impossible to prioritize the enablers, the political decisions, the capability improvements that are required, the sustainment programs, and the demand of the 3 single services within the financial limitations. The next commander of Joint Forces Command is going to have his work cut out. Theatre entry as a major capability might just go. The dependencies on coalition and the presumptions on partners and trusted, reliable allies have been laid down for over 2 years in a narrative that's come from successive Secretaries of State. Even if the UK got to a 2.5% baseline for spending, theatre entry on its own looks like it is becoming unaffordable for the UK. The trade-off might well be a position that looks at ballistic missile defence as being central. But that's a ballistic missile defence for expeditionary forces as thought about by the Ministry of Defence, and not ballistic missile defence which is thought about by the politicians across the road, which is for homeland protection. And therein lies the rub. There is, I think, a talking at cross purposes between the politicians and the military. and neither quite understands where the other is coming from. The political will to change exists. The will to give good political guidance exists. The will to set planning assumptions that are unusually not simply optimistic or unrealistic, but reverse that trend. And this is critical because the National Security Advisor, the Prime Minister and senior officers understand the enemies employing this liminal strategy and that they will take the decision and fund the correct balance. What they haven't had yet is the correct offering. So what do we expect to see? Big buys in equipment terms, possibly. Money for ballistic missile defence, cyber and space, almost certainly. A headcount reduction, probably. The army going down to 60 to 70,000 is certainly possible. A reinvestment in electronic warfare, an improvement in war stocks, starting to build an integrated air and missile defence for the UK, which contributes to the Northern Group as part of the Joint Expeditionary Force. Future combat air will focus widely, and a reaffirmment of the Royal Marines' position, if not their specific role. And a promise, of course, of more in due course when the programmes are costed and run out. And we'll have the key phrases. The stock phrases of fusion doctrine, modern deterrence. Perhaps we'll see something around the weaponisation of memory or the democratisation of space. Buzzwords will abound. And yet more important is possibly what's not going to be mentioned. Will the F-35 squadron numbers reduce markedly? When the RAF talk about 8+2 fighter squadrons, they talk about 8 Typhoon and 2 F-35. Does this mean 48 F-35s, even 36? Or does it mean something else over the transition of a lifetime? This we'll need to understand. We'll need to understand more about what it means for the homeland and also what it means for readiness, because if spending doesn't increase, readiness will fall. Training and exercises will also pay the price of a lack of investment. And I guess this comes to the question of, so what are we going to stop doing and when are we going to hear about it? Well, I think the only thing we're going to hear at the NATO summit is a UK's commitment to double or at least increase the numbers of troops in Afghanistan. And they will do it in the short term. But this means that if you're deployed in Afghanistan at the moment, be prepared to stag on in theatre. You ain't coming home. The numbers will increase from the troops that are due to deploy, and those that are out there will be staying for the foreseeable future. We'll hear more commitment on the North Atlantic as a joint operating area for the Royal Navy. And there were commitment to greater ASW, perhaps even leadership in anti-submarine warfare against the Russian threat. But these are the same assets that are supposed to be protecting the carrier strike groups, the littoral strike groups, and performing functions elsewhere in the world. So there is some risk here. So the best case out of this is we'll get clear political guidance and ambition. Outside of the buzzwords, agile, flexible, innovation, technology, we'll probably see transformative change again. But what it needs to be is about how we will fight and what we will fight over. And I don't think that the NSCR articulated that particularly well. It also needs to be a little bit about people, which is something often forgotten in these big reviews. So, the personnel are good, but they're disheartened, and they're not particularly stupid either. They know that a defence review that's been going on for more than a year that fails to be announced when it was due to be at the end of June and again at the end of July is going to be detrimental to them. They understand that 2.5% won't solve the problem. They understand that 3% might start to make inroads. But recapitalisation, what they need to fight effectively in the environment exceeds those amounts by quite a lot. They also know that when it comes to it, it won't be the senior officers, the Treasury, or the politicians that will pay the price. It'll be the soldiers, sailors, Marines, and aviators who put their lives on the line. I'm not sure at the moment that MDP takes such realism into account. But then again, we're not exactly sure if it will ever be published.
Peter, thank you so much for that very rich presentation. You started with that essential apparent contradiction between so much has changed, but yet nothing seems to be changing in terms of force structure. But then I think you gave us a real tour of almost every important element of UK defence capability, and almost every sentence of that section of your presentation, I think at least some of us were saying, well, I'd like to hear a bit more about that, and I'd like to hear a bit more about this, which is, I think, a testament of the depth of your research group's work on MDP and how much there is to say, and how much is due to come up in questions. So I'll expect our audience to come up with some really piercing questions in relation to some of Peter's really thought-provoking propositions. Before we do so, however, it's over to John. Please.
Thank you.
Perfect.
Good evening, everybody.
19 minutes.
I never understand why people make these so tall. It always seems a terrible blight on British engineering from a few years ago. Never quite understood it. I think I'll be adding to the sense of happiness and joy that Peter brought to the discussion earlier. But I want to try and unpack some of the thoughts of Malcolm and Peter, both of whom it's a great honour to follow, by the way, through some of the numbers. But before I start, just so you're aware, a Mr. B. Johnson left his CV at the entrance to RUSI earlier this evening. So if anybody's looking to offer opportunities to a great national thinker, then come to me and I'll pass it on. I just want to take 10 minutes or so to deconstruct MDP from why we're having a piece of work in government called the Modernising Defence Programme, through to a critical review of its constituent parts, their purposes, and supposed outputs and outcomes. So as soon as I use those phrases, purposes, outputs, and outcomes, you know that I'm talking about programs and projects, the stuff that gets things done rather than the piece of the paper that have policy on the top of them. So to begin with, analysts are probably right that the source points of MDP are, as we've heard, STSR 2015, and secondly, the appointment of a new Secretary of State in Gavin Williamson in 2017. This was, of course, midway through the National Security Capability Review. Well, beginning with the former, you'll recall the headlines of STSR 2015. From the time, people were saying that the defence budget was balanced. There was no more unfunded wedge. The above-inflation uplift to the equipment plan of 1% in real terms would be there year on year, giving us a 10-year forward programme of just shy of 180 billion. There would be a through-life purchase of 138 F-35s, not 48 or 36, 138, of which the first 48 F-35Bs were politically and small c commercially committed. There would be a 2-carrier Royal Navy group, 1 carrier group always available at high readiness, with a mix, as yet undecided, of escorts and support vehicles, subsea and on the sea. There would be 4 like-for-like nuclear deterrent submarines, costing us 31 billion with a contingency of 10 billion. The service life of the Typhoon aircraft would be extended to 2040, with 2 new squadrons created, giving us 7 in total, but of course we now know that there'll probably be 8. There will be new money for cyber operations, principally defensive protective operations, and we'll come on to that in a moment, about 1.9 billion or so, and 2 billion new money for special forces. There will be a deployable force of 50,000 women and men at high readiness, and 2 very rapid reaction brigades. And there will always be a baseline of 1.2% of the equipment plan to be spent on science and technology. So government would sponsor blue sky research funding in defence. It actually equated to the operating budget of DSTL, so no new money, but the thought is a kind one anyway. That's just 3 years ago, but it seems like another age. After the vote for Brexit, the corresponding devaluation of the pound, the election of last year, which gifted us the uncertainty of a hung parliament, and other elections, actions and reactions of friends and foes alike, the confidence of SDSR 2015, viewed today, seems a sham, an exercise in hubris, not least the assertion that it was financially robust. With the post-2017 review in full swing under the National Security Advisor, conducted remarkably in part because of new threats and uncertainties unseen just 2 years earlier by the authors, including the National Security Advisor, the new Secretary of State insisted that defence should be decoupled from an overarching stocktake, and defence would conduct its work in-house, if not in isolation. So the Modernising Defence programme was born from all of that, and here we are. But what is it? Well, it's principally 4 strands of work. There's an organisational strand, so looking once more at the structure of the department and the manner in which it is organised at the macro. The efficiency of processes and practices and ways of working, especially following the DNS transformation work and the Levine reforms, another strand. Third strand, commercial strand, looking at the flexibility and innovations needed across commercial relationships between MOD and suppliers, right through the supply chain, onshore and offshore. And the fourth strand, as Peter's already talked about, the defence strategy and capability requirement, Joint Force 25 or Future Force 35, Dreamy Force 2050, whatever phrase we want to put on it. Now, the problem with being a professor is I'm reasonably comfortable with logic and I quite like language. If one is modernising something, it's usually because the current state is stale or old-fashioned or not fit for the modern age. You'll find that to be the definitions of modernising. But the results of SDSR 2015 was supposed to be the solution. Google the coverage. The way we do war, or deter it hopefully into the 20s, 30s, 40s and beyond. Why should that vision, if the work was done properly, need modernising? Could it be that with the defence budget we have and the changing nature of the threats as captured over those 2 years, it's just unaffordable? And if something is unaffordable, then we need a new, higher budget or a pared-back programme. So where to begin with such an obvious binary? More money or less programme? Well, colleagues from within the department are reporting privately that the resources for the equipment plan of SDSR 15 are short by at least 5%, or some 10 billion. The NAO, of course, thinks it could be as much as 20 billion. There's an ambition for a defence space programme that will consume another 5 billion in early phase development. There's an ambition for a significantly more overt cyber offensive programme as part of 21st century deterrence posture. That would cost us, so I'm told, not my numbers, other people's numbers, another 3 billion. A ballistic missile defence system for the homeland, missing from SDSR 15, would cost another 10 to 20 billion. Procurement costs not through life costs. Historical efficiencies, as yet unfound, equate to an additional £7.5 billion. So a total, if my numbers are right, of about 45.5 billion over a 10-year EP period, or greater than the total annual defence budget. And frustratingly, that does not include the significant investment we would need from government for science and technology early year TRLs, because all of that is not going to come from commerce. It can't. So modernising defence is a budgetary and resourcing problem. It's also a prosperity challenge. We know from Philip Dunn's report, issued earlier today, that MOD spending per annum with industry and commerce is, and I'll do this by region, 1.6 billion in Scotland, 103 million in Northern Ireland, close to £1 billion in Wales, 2 billion in northwest England, 100 million in northeast England, 250 million roughly in Yorkshire and Humberside, 845 million in the East Midlands, 918 million in the West Midlands, similar number in Anglia, east of England, over £500 million in London, close to 5 billion in the southeast, and over 5 billion in southwest England. These are significant sums throughout a single year, a total of about 18 to 19 billion spent in the UK onshore per annum, giving us directly within those businesses and beneficiaries over 123,000 jobs, multiplied probably by another factor of 5 for support jobs within supply chains. That's a huge part of our economy. So keeping defence robust and relevant matters for that significant regional investment and associated employment opportunities. Beyond this, Mr. Williamson has said that he views a strident Russia as the principal strategic threat to the UK and NATO. He said so here. In fact, you'll recall that he robustly told Mr. Putin to, quote, shut up and go away. But nobody can observe actions in eastern Ukraine and Crimea and not think that Mr. Williamson probably has a point. I was shocked earlier this year. I travelled to Vilnius to give a speech in their parliament. I was collected by a Lithuanian colonel from the airport, similar age to me, in his 50s. He'd been a conscript in the USSR, come back obviously to Lithuania post-91, and told me, as a matter of fact, comment over a beer, John, I expect to be shot by the Russians when they invade my country. Well, that's a shocking statement, but of course anybody's entitled to their opinion. The following day, I had a meeting with a senior government minister, a man in his mid-30s, multilingual, been working commercially, had come back to Lithuania to take a place in government because he thought it was his duty. There's an old-fashioned concept. And this very erudite gentleman said that he expected to be put up against the wall with his family by the Russians when they invaded his country. Now, they may be going to the same dinner parties, they may share a couple of mentors or mates, but the sense is still there that these are dangerous, difficult times. If Russia is a clear and present danger to NATO, especially in the Baltic states, how do we deter? And what does that tell us for MDP? Well, in the Cold War during the 1970s and 80s, for example, we conducted multiple and regular national and NATO-wide exercises and tactical evaluations in Europe. We know from the opening of archives after the collapse of the Soviet Union that NATO readiness, preparedness, and lethality were compelling factors in deterring Soviet aggression. Having lots of British soldiers, airmen, airwomen, and their families stationed in Germany with their colleagues was part of that deterrence posture. Now, I had a little look a short while ago. A typical NATO tactical evaluation in central Germany had within its scenario military and civilian casualties in the hundreds of thousands. That was before the scenario went nuclear or the bad guy went home. Much of BAOR and RAFG and their families, of course, were to be sacrificed. I had a little look at our last tactical evaluation for the Royal Air Force in the mid-90s, and in that scenario, with 4 Tornado squadrons flying from a particular base, over that 2-week period, 1 week active tactical evaluation, second week more paper-based exercise, just shy of 800,000 people were killed. These are substantial numbers. Nobody conceives of conventional defence today through such horrors. How could we? Indeed, the UK training budget is constantly pruned as a kind of spend regulator. And our ability to reinforce, let's say the Baltic states, from the UK seems short of lift capabilities and pan-European rolling stock. And of course, the mid-90s is just 2 generations ago. Both of my children were born before that last tactical evaluation, old style, took place. Understanding MDP through the lens of the Russian threat alone, therefore, when compared to our stance and force structure just a generation or so ago, seems a little difficult in the logic that we've applied. Maybe one of the Defence Secretary's ministers can help me. Tobias Ellwood told the Defence Select Committee just a week or so ago that an uplift of defence spending by half of 1% of GDP to 2.5% would, his words, assist greatly. 0.5% of GDP is about 9 billion per annum, depending upon how you make the calculation, and assuming our economy does not shrink as we navigate Brexit. That is a huge leap politically, though closer to recent historical spending profiles, of course. But half of that, just 4.5 billion per annum, an uplift of 0.25%, would buy out the strategic shopping list I discussed at the beginning of this presentation and secure the investment in the regions and the jobs that go with it. That's a really interesting political message, and that would assist greatly. Whether or not that returns the UK to the level of defence capability it had before austerity Britain, that's not the argument I'm making. Rather, my gentle suggestion is that for the emerging future force, whatever we call it, with refreshed capabilities, an uplift is required. In the press, we've seen a figure of about 20 billion over 5 years, supposedly being sought by the Secretary of State. If that's not speculation, and I have it on good authority that it's not, him and I seem to have come to very similar conclusions. Lastly, the clue to MDP is in the title, programme. This means that it needs to have identified packages of work going forward, a time-bound schedule showing how those packages interlock, a clear budget of those work packages properly resourced to the values we've discussed, proper, visible governance and ownership, real independent assurance, and clearly understood enterprise-level risks and opportunities. And some of those opportunities, of course, are with allies and peers, and that doesn't seem to be particularly addressed to date. If we have all of that, then we have a programme, and that programme is for the defence of this country and is properly modern. Anything short of that, and we have an aspiration. And we must remember that hope is not a strategy. So we'll have to await the announcement with great interest, if indeed we have one. Thank you very much.
It's always a challenge, John, to be the last presenter, but you fulfilled our expectations admirably and got us all excited and full of really interesting questions to ask. And I'm going to stand up so I can see you. When you're answering questions, can you make sure that all our audience can see you when you're doing so? Probably a good idea to stand up in that regard. And I think we have a microphone, don't we, Alana? So let me just let me see. There's a gentleman right at the back, just beside the aisle. And if you could stand up and introduce yourself before asking your question. And let me remind you, it's all off the record from now on.